This is Sophaville's Dark Season presents The Dead Famous, Episode 6, with Ronald Moger as James Montague, Jonah Richert as the voice of the press, Hazel Young as Helen Beeston and Sister Anna Patrick, and Colin Rance as Geoffrey Montague. By the time I returned home that night, I'd taken quite enough mental beatings for my existence and was quite prepared to just disappear off. If it hadn't been for the responsibility of keeping my house going and the promised joy of completing my collection, I might very well have left my clothes on a beach somewhere and disappeared into the ether. The thought of this future possibility distracted me temporarily from the light switch that had failed to react to my touch. There was yet again no power, but how could that be? It seemed my electricity bill had not been successfully paid, though I swore I'd phoned it through and sent off a cheque. This seemed most odd. I lit up an oil lamp my dad had left in our understairs cupboard, and a rummage through the day's post revealed the reality. My cheque had bounced, and they'd indeed cut me off. This was most inconvenient. With a sigh, I had no choice but to leave the bills for another day. It was late, and I just wanted to get some rest. I felt like some Dickensian miser as I scaled the stairs to bed that night, oil lamp in hand. I hoped things would get better the next day, so I'd end up being maybe David Copperfield rather than Ebenezer Scrooge. The office was again a blizzard of activity. There's no great motivator like a death sentence, and that's exactly what these people felt they'd been given. Each or any of them could be struck down by the editor at any moment, and I immediately found their frenzied work combined with their sycophancy towards their now more powerful superiors to bring a lump of food to my throat. I slunk away to the sanctity of my office and stared blankly at the day's assignments. Not one item interested me or motivated me enough to put the proverbial pen to paper. I no longer felt the drive that I had once had when starting this career all those years ago. The exposure to celebrity had once given me, it just seemed to have gradually waned as the articles favoured gossip more and more, and interviews were phoned in, actually and metaphorically. They came from freelancers, press agencies. It was no longer a golden age for me. The only remnants of those past happy times were preserved forever in my photos. At least that part of my life would stay untouched and remain a reliable constant. I found myself smiling, wrapped in my own little world, and then jumped to a start as my door received a loud rapping noise. Barry was there with two policemen. The officers questioned me in my office for only a short period. They wanted to know details of any contact I'd had with various names they mentioned, if I'd had any notes I'd made at the time, photographs of the area. I assured them I had, but as the office was going through a transitional phase of some turmoil, they wouldn't be found easily at this time, but I would endeavour to get them delivered to the station as soon as was humanly possible. They seemed genuinely grateful for this gesture and bid me a good day. As they left, Barry gave me a dirty look, and a few minutes later, when I went to fetch a cup of tea, I caught him bemoaning my behaviour to Louise in the kitchen. He turned to confront me, stating that he knew I was meticulous about my filing in the office, and that I would have had no problem at all in cooperating with the police there and then. Why was I delaying this? What exactly was I hiding? His insistence drew me to distraction as I poured the water from my tea, and I accidentally let the kettle's direction slip and drench Barry's leg. I apologised as he shrieked, first in agony and then accusingly as he blamed me for what he believed was not at all an accident. I assured him I didn't know what he was talking about and left him to continue whining as Louise arrived with a cold press to provide his leg with some sort of temporary relief.
19. Miss Bessie Cooper, actress. 20. Mrs. Lily Pitt, actress. 21. Mr. Arthur Hill, playwright, screenwriter.
Louise's behaviour of late had perhaps become an annoyance, but Barry's newfound interest in me was posing a growing threat. With so many photos yet to achieve, the last thing I needed was a nosy paparazzo spying on my every move. I filed what work I had and went out to lunch. On my return, I saw Louise chewing at her fingernails nervously outside my room, perhaps waiting for a meeting with me. As I walked within better view, I saw, behind her, Barry stand up from behind my office desk, studying various examples of my work in his grubby mitts. I hid out of view swiftly, but kept an eye on them both for a short period. Louise was clearly keeping watch while Barry took my lunch break as an opportunity to rummage through my private documents. As far as I was concerned, an act of war had been declared. It was just a shame that they were so painfully unarmed. My retribution upon them was swift. I knew the area in which Barry drank. I also knew he liked nothing better than to celebrate each payday with a night out accompanied by one of the escort agency's finest. A night's work discreetly following with my camera meant that I was able to gather pictures of Barry slobbering over this hired harlot in all sorts of public situations. A sickening task, but a worthwhile one. A satisfying shift in my darkroom the next day resulted in an envelope winging its way to Barry's rivals at various tabloid newspapers, and, just for good measure, to his ex-wife, who was at that time suing him for custody of their children. Lastly, for good measure, one more envelope was sent to our dear editor. Any other time of newspaper's life, this would have been swept under the carpet. But these were tough times. Scandals were not needed, and after a stern chat in the editor's office, apparently neither was Barry. Louise was a simpler pimple to pop. I told her that I was getting increasingly nervous about our positions at the paper, and that I wasn't sure my work was up to my usual standard. She said I shouldn't worry, and said that she would help in any way that she could. As a favour, here and then, I asked her to make a few handwritten notes on an article I was to submit, and that it would calm my nerves if she also found the same good and bad points that I had found. She agreed, and after she handed the notes back, I copied her handwriting until I perfected it. Then I wrote a letter to her ex-boyfriend telling him that she wanted him back, and that she also had come into a rather large inheritance. I guessed the layabout's interest would be piqued, not least because he had a car to support. I also knew that Louise wouldn't have been able to handle a visit by her wretched ex-beau. The ruse must have worked, as 4 days later she failed to turn up to work and continued to stay at home for another week, without explanation or even a call to the office. I'd voiced my concern to the editor that I couldn't work with assistants like this, and pointed out how sad it was that she'd been forced to take so much time off of late, especially as her work had been suffering already. On her return, she too was promptly dispatched to the wastepaper bin, and I was free to continue my plans unhindered. On my way home, I found my feet to be a little lighter than usual. My everyday thoughts are generally focused on a few base things: the purchasing of food, the cleaning of clothes, the list I've yet to complete. But this day felt different. I had a weight lifted off my shoulders. I found myself smiling as I looked up to the sky and saw the shadow of a distant skylark against the dusk. Birds can be deceptive creatures. As a child, I enjoyed seeing the skylarks flitting around, seemingly with no particular pattern or reason, and with the lowest level of troubles. I later understood they were actually waiting for the air pressure to change so that they could then fly up and make meals of the insects now forced to these new atmospheres. While everyone watched the bird ducking and diving as if going around some inane task, he was actually biding his time and then striking when the time was just right. He was being more productive than perhaps any of the other birds were during their entire week, and with much better results. I always admired the skylarks. The next day at work was a strange balance. The pressure of knowing who was to be let go had alleviated itself, but the work left behind by those rejected souls still had to be done until the paper had reformatted itself successfully, and, until then, I was busier than usual. It was time for a holiday. I sat down to look through the day's tasks, and as the documents in front of me blurred as I daydreamed about what I might achieve on my break from work, my phone rang. Before I could give my usual greeting, Louise was already blubbing at me down the phone about how the editor had let her go and how difficult life was and other rudimentary details I was apparently supposed to care about. I'm not one for understanding conversations involving the female mind. They will alleviate themselves of their daily sufferings and complaints onto your non-caring ears, with no forethought of whether the recipient of all this irrelevant carping actually cares or is even willing to do anything to solve their problems. It really comes across as the most selfish activity, and I never have time for it, and I've never understood it. The best option is always to nip it in the bud as quickly as possible. I did my best to interrupt Louise's flow by explaining that I really couldn't talk right now, as there was so much work to do, and, inconveniently misunderstanding me for wanting to actually postpone her blubbing for another time, said she would meet me in the Lamb and Flag after work. Despite the inanity of the previous meeting, I agreed just to momentarily get rid of her and continue with my holiday plans. My hobby had taken me around the metropolitan area and the counties surrounding it, but I was too aware of the need to venture further afield for my next photograph. If the police, and even perhaps some journalists, had started snooping around for a possible link to recent events, the last thing I wanted to give them was the gift of another instalment to the story. But I was going to have to ignore their concerns and investigations if I was going to complete my work. And so Miss Lily Pitt comes into the equation. Lily had been relatively successful in her days as a television actress in the early 60s, but had used her acting skills and ample bosom to make the move to the bright lights of Los Angeles, where she'd found a part in an absolutely dire, yet incredibly popular, daytime soap opera called All My Mother's Sons. The role brought her the level of celebrity she wanted, and there she remains until the 1990s when she retired from acting, only to wheel herself out for chat shows and award ceremonies when the retirement pot called for it. Living in the Hollywood Hills and not returning to the UK frequently enough for me to plan a satisfactory meeting with her, I decided to pay a visit to Miss Pitt and perhaps take time in the wondrous surroundings of Hollywood and the nearby Burbank at the same time. I booked my hotel and a flight leaving the next day online, and, smiling with a well-deserved sense of soon-to-come satisfaction, I took out my list and drew a line under Miss Pitt's photograph in light pencil. A new direction in things was exactly what I needed to reignite my desire to finish the list. I'd made a promise, however, and the first direction I would take after work would be towards the pub to listen to Louise. The dead fly in the dregs of my beer had given me a good few minutes of entertainment, and the well-placed sighs and tuts of empathy had kept Louise rambling for a good half hour before she claimed she'd been thoughtless, that I had troubles of my own, and so on, and asked me about how the office was and what I'd been up to since her leaving. I told her I was planning to go on holiday to Los Angeles, and that I was looking forward to seeing the film studios and possibly a few stars on the way. She smiled at me, and just as she seemed about to respond, I sensed an oath approaching. Barry had come to join us, as Louise had thoughtfully invited him along, and she was sure that I wouldn't mind. I needed another drink if I was to suffer through another half hour of this level of company, so I stood to go to the bar and successfully but unintentionally let my list drop to the ground. I was unfortunately not aware of this before I returned to the table with my drink. Barry had already poured through it and asked me why I'd circled some names, penciled others, why I was carrying this old ragged supplement around with me. I had no answers, and frankly did not care to share them with the troglodyte anyway. I snatched a list back from his grubby mitts and rammed it into my inside jacket pocket. I chastised him for being so nosy. I reminded him that he was not being paid for such base behaviour anymore, and bid them both good night. The next morning was spent planning and packing for the evening's impending journey. I had everything I needed: my camera, passport, my list. My list. It was not in my jacket pocket, where I had so assuredly placed it the night before. I checked my bag again. My other clothes, it was definitely gone. As I tried to think about how and where it had gone, my phone rang. The editor said that he was on his way over, that there were a few issues he wanted to discuss with me before I left for holiday. His hands-on attitude had its drawbacks. Not that I saw any benefits. He was at the house within the hour. I offered him a cup of tea and led him through to the kitchen. This was all too cosy for my liking. I've never liked visitors, and their position in my work life made no bearing over their level of perceived acceptance. My home was my sanctuary. His presence was an extreme intrusion that I had to suffer. He spoke of developments in the paper's future and within the workforce. I paid attention when I caught him mention my work from time to time, but it was an otherwise dragged-out conversation that could have waited until my return to the office. Even my attempted distraction of constantly boiling the kettle didn't seem to stem his flow, but luckily 3 cups of tea later he did need the toilet, and so he disappeared upstairs to find the bathroom. So relieved was I by this temporary reprieve that I completely forgot about my private collection. He was walking straight towards my darkroom and the collection in the room adjacent. What to do? As I tried to call him back down as I headed to the stairs, planning to tell him I'd forgotten the toilet was actually blocked, and then I heard his voice. He called out that I had obviously been keeping something from him all this time. This couldn't be the end. There was still too much to do. I grabbed my clothes iron from under the stairs and rushed up to stop him from spilling out my story to the world. He smiled as he turned towards me, but was stopped mid-sentence and in growing horror as I brought the iron down upon the side of his head. His horror became my own as I saw in his hand my framed tickets to see Crackerjack from all those years before. He'd evidently found them in the landing hall before even reaching any of the other rooms, and apparently he had never seen anything of my collection. I held the iron in one hand, my forehead in the other as the editor moaned on the floor. There was no other choice. There was no other way out. There was simply too much still to do with my list. He tried to get up as I now violently connected the iron with his now bleeding skull again and again, until finally he no longer moved. His head leaked onto the floor like pancake batter being poured into a pan. The carpet was, of course, ruined. It didn't matter. I'd be leaving shortly and I could deal with it on my return. Dragging him into the photograph display room, I propped him up inside a cabinet, managed to close the door despite his weight trying to lurch it open again. A chair under the handle, and I was off on holiday to sunny Los Angeles. As I was leaving the house, the phone rang once more. I didn't want to answer it, but couldn't risk anybody coming to the house looking for me as an alternative to calling. Joy upon joys, it was Barry on the other end. He immediately launched into a tirade of accusations. Although I'd rammed the list of 30 faces into my pocket, it had evidently fallen straight out again as I left the pub. Barry had gone through it, used what few brain cells he had to come up with what he thought I was up to, and, ingeniously on his part, informed me that he was going to go straight to the police. Barry was always the most unsympathetic of individuals, but on this occasion I was grateful of his unintentional consideration towards me. His warning me of all of this meant that he would apparently want me to have a sporting chance to get to the airport before he or anyone else arrived to stop me. Good on him. I put the phone down while he was mid-sentence and, grabbing my things, went outdoor. I was glad to be heading towards the airport for what I hoped would be my most satisfying photograph yet, but as I entered the sliding doors of the terminal, I felt uncharacteristically uneasy, even a little nervous. Usually things went well as I always planned my strategies myself, and apart from 1 or 2 mild hiccups, no major problems or unforeseen setbacks had occurred. This time, I guess things were a little different. I was venturing into the unknown. In the UK, the people I'd sought out had been living relatively peaceful and calm lives, but the Americans had their own version of celebrity retirement with its fenced communities and private security firms. There are many obstacles to overcome, and it would all have to be planned, checked, and executed all within a short space of time. I focused on this as I approached the check-in desk, and was so deep within my thoughts that I didn't notice Barry and Louise enter the same sliding doors I'd passed through only moments earlier. In next week's final episode, James flees abroad, but what will become of him, and how will he complete the collection if he doesn't return? Stay tuned. New episodes are released to all streaming services every Wednesday. Subscribe now to get notified on its release. All music is by Shane Ivers of Silverman's Sound. The Dead Famous was written and produced by Ronald Moger. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at This Is Sophaville.